The earth shook under her feet. Windows rattled. Dishes trembled on the kitchen counter. Margaret Thompson ran outside, shielding her eyes from the whipping wind. A helicopter was descending into her backyard. She clutched her apron. Her heart pounded. She hadn't seen one of them in nearly 2 decades. But as the chopper's doors opened, she knew exactly who had come back. Back in 2007, Margaret Thompson was a waitress at a small-town diner in rural Georgia. It wasn't a fancy place, just a corner diner with red leather booths, checkered floors, and a flickering neon sign that buzzed louder than the coffee machine. But it was honest work, and for Margaret, that meant everything. She worked the morning shift 6 days a week, starting at 5 a.m. sharp. She poured coffee for truckers, chatted with regulars about the weather, and always remembered who liked their eggs over easy and who wanted bacon crispy, not floppy. At home, she had her hands full. Margaret was a single mother raising 2 daughters, ages 8 and 11 at the time. On top of that, she cared for her elderly mother, who was battling early-stage dementia. Every dollar counted. Every shift mattered. Still, she carried herself with grace. Her co-workers called her Mama T, not just because she was older than most of them, but because she had a calm, nurturing way about her. She always knew when someone needed a pep talk, or a hug, or just a warm plate of food. Then came the day that would quietly change everything. It was a cold, rainy afternoon in early November. Business was slow. The sky was gray and the rain fell in steady sheets, making the glass windows sweat. Margaret was wiping down a booth near the front when the bell above the door jingled. 2 children stood in the entrance, soaked to the bone. They couldn't have been older than 10. The older one, maybe a boy around 10, had his arm protectively around the younger girl's shoulders. Their clothes were 2 sizes too small, clinging to their tiny frames. Their shoes were worn through, and their socks made squishing sounds as they walked. They didn't speak. They didn't make eye contact. They just slid into a booth near the back, heads down, huddling close to each other for warmth. Margaret noticed right away. Something about them tugged at her. She approached slowly, gently. Her apron was damp from the steam of the dishwasher, and her hands ached from a long shift. Still, she knelt slightly at their table so she wouldn't tower over them. "Hey there," she said softly, her southern accent warm and soothing. "Can I get y'all something to eat?" The boy looked up for the first time, his eyes wide and unsure. We don't have money," he whispered. "We're just trying to get warm." For a moment, Margaret just stood there, heart breaking. She didn't know where they'd come from or what they'd been through. But she didn't need the details to know one thing. These kids were hungry. Without another word, she stood up and walked to the kitchen. She didn't ask her manager. She didn't care about policy. She didn't even glance at the register. She made them each a hot grilled cheese sandwich, just the way she'd make it for her girls. Extra butter, toasted golden brown. She added a bowl of tomato soup, made fresh that morning. And for dessert, she cut 2 slices of warm apple pie and added a scoop of vanilla ice cream on top, even though it was usually an extra charge. She placed the tray in front of them without saying much. Just a soft, "Here you go, sweethearts. Eat as much as you want." The kids stared at the food like it was a feast from heaven, and while they ate, Margaret walked back to the kitchen, filled a little paper bag with extra biscuits and jam, and slipped it into the boys' backpack when they weren't looking. She didn't ask questions. She didn't pry. She just made sure they were safe, full, and dry before they left. Her manager wasn't thrilled. In fact, he made it clear that the cost of the food would come out of her next paycheck. Margaret just nodded and said quietly, "They're children, and I hope if my girls were ever in trouble, someone would do the same." It wasn't the first time Margaret had helped someone without expecting anything in return, and in her mind, it wasn't a big deal. But for the 2 children, it was everything. They left without even saying goodbye. Just a glance back at the door, and they disappeared into the rain. Margaret stood by the window that night wondering where they'd gone. She never knew their names, never saw their faces again until today. Because now, 18 years later, her quiet, ordinary life was about to change forever. Those two children were Liam and Jayla Carter, siblings, orphans. At just 10 and 7 years old, their world had already crumbled. 3 weeks before they walked into Margaret Thompson's diner, a fire had torn through their small apartment building on the outskirts of Atlanta. It started in the unit below theirs and spread fast. Their mother died trying to shield them. Their father succumbed to smoke inhalation before the firefighters even arrived. Liam remembered the way his sister screamed. Jayla remembered the way he never let go of her hand. They had no grandparents, no aunts or uncles, no one willing to step in. So the system did what it could. They were placed in a temporary shelter, overcrowded, underfunded, and cold in every way that mattered. The food was barely edible. The staff meant well, but they were overwhelmed. And the older boys at the shelter were rough, loud, and sometimes cruel. Liam did his best to protect Jayla, but she cried most nights, and he cried when she wasn't looking. Then one night they heard a caseworker mention that they might be separated. Jayla would be moved to a foster home for younger girls. Liam would go to a different home, so they ran. They slipped out during dinner, walked for hours, and hitchhiked part of the way. No plan, no destination, just a desire to stay together. That rainy afternoon, when they walked into Margaret's diner, they were tired, soaked, and more scared than they'd ever admit. But that moment, the moment when Margaret knelt down, looked them in the eyes and asked if they were hungry, it changed something in them. She didn't treat them like burdens. She didn't question their story. She didn't scold them or act suspicious. She just saw two kids who needed help. And she gave them warmth, food, and dignity. And they never forgot it. That simple meal was the first time in weeks they had felt safe, human, seen. After they left the diner, a local sheriff's deputy spotted them walking down a nearby highway. But instead of throwing them back into the same shelter, this officer took time to hear their story. He called in a different agency, a private Christian foster network that placed siblings together in smaller homes. That night, Liam and Jayla arrived at the home of Ron and Melissa Watkins, a middle-aged couple with no children of their own, but hearts big enough for a dozen. The Watkins gave them clean clothes, their own beds, and something else they hadn't had in a long time: stability. It wasn't perfect. Liam struggled with nightmares and anger. Jayla had trouble speaking up in school. But they had each other, and they had people who cared. They would still think about the diner from time to time. Jayla remembered the tomato soup. Liam remembered the flaky biscuits and the way Margaret had winked at them like they were regular customers, not strays, and they both remembered her name tag, Margaret, and the gold bracelet she wore, the one that slid down her wrist when she served the pie. It said, "Love wins." At first, they thought it was just jewelry, but as they grew older, the phrase became something more, a kind of motto, a quiet promise they made to themselves. One day, we'll find her and thank her. Over the years, Liam focused on structure and discipline. He got a scholarship to a military academy and from there joined the U.S. Air Force. He became a transport pilot and earned several commendations. Jayla, meanwhile, discovered a passion for science and math. She entered every competition she could, sometimes just for the free snacks. But she was brilliant. By the time she graduated high school, she had won a national STEM award and earned a full ride to MIT. But no matter how far they climbed, no matter how many medals or degrees they earned, they never stopped talking about her, the woman who fed them without asking for anything in return, the woman who didn't know she was saving 2 lives in a single afternoon. They didn't know her last name. They didn't know the name of the diner. All they had were scattered memories, the peach mural painted on the water tower, the rainy day, and that gold bracelet. But those memories were enough to fuel something powerful, because the truth was, Margaret didn't just give them food, she gave them hope. Hope that good people still existed. Hope that even in a world full of loss, love could still win. And now, after 18 years, they were finally in a position to return the favor, to give back, to the woman who gave them their first second chance. They just had to find her. Years passed. Life moved forward. But the memory of that rainy afternoon in the diner never faded. Jayla Carter had grown into a brilliant and determined young woman. She studied aerospace engineering at MIT and later joined a private space tech firm that worked alongside NASA. She designed fuel-efficient propulsion systems, led a team of researchers, and even had a patent or two under her name by the time she turned 30. Liam Carter, on the other hand, found his purpose in the skies. After graduating from a military academy, he earned his wings as a pilot in the U.S. Air Force. He flew humanitarian missions, medical supply drops, and transport flights into war zones and disaster-struck regions. On the outside, they both seemed like shining success stories, living proof of resilience and perseverance. But on the inside, there was still a shared piece of their past they hadn't closed. A moment they carried with them silently. The woman who changed everything. They never talked about it much as adults. Life had taken them in separate directions. They hadn't even seen each other in nearly 5 years. Until fate stepped in. It was a warm autumn evening in Atlanta when it happened. A veterans charity was hosting a gala to raise funds for displaced servicemen and women. Liam had been invited as an honored guest and keynote speaker. Jayla had come as a corporate sponsor, representing her aerospace firm. Neither knew the other would be there. But as Liam stepped off the small stage after his speech, he caught a glimpse of a familiar face in the crowd. Jayla. They locked eyes, and just like that, the years between them vanished. They hugged tight, tight enough to make up for all the years they'd missed. That night, over dinner at a quiet corner table, they laughed, cried, and swapped stories. And then Liam did something unexpected. He pulled out a paper napkin and laid it flat between them. "Remember the diner?" he asked, tapping his finger on the center of the napkin. "The grilled cheese? That slice of pie? The bag of biscuits she snuck into my backpack?" Jayla's smile faded into something softer. Her eyes welled up. "I think about her all the time," she whispered. "That was the first time in our lives that someone treated us like we mattered." Liam nodded. "We owe her everything." They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in the same memory. Then, almost in unison, they said, "We need to find her." And so, the pact was made, right there on that napkin. Find the woman who fed them, and thank her, in the biggest way possible. But it wouldn't be easy. They didn't have her full name, no address, no records. They weren't even sure if the diner still existed. All they remembered was that her name tag said Margaret, that she wore a gold bracelet that read "Love Wins," and that the town had a giant peach painted on the water tower. That was it. But Jayla was an engineer, and engineers love puzzles. Liam was a pilot, and pilots never give up when there's a destination to reach, so they got to work. For the next 6 months, every spare minute of their nights and weekends was spent digging. They scoured old diner staff rosters, archived Yelp, reviews, and scanned through faded photographs in regional newspapers. Jayla filed Freedom of Information requests for employee records from food service unions. Liam contacted local historical societies and even posted on Facebook groups for rural Georgia communities, asking if anyone remembered a diner with a giant peach water tower nearby. Dozens of leads came in. Most led nowhere. Sometimes they'd get excited, only to hit another dead end. But they refused to quit. Jayla even developed a facial recognition script that scanned yearbook photos and regional news clippings from the early 2000s, cross-referencing them with Margaret, and bracelets matching the phrase "Love Wins." Liam joked that they were on the most important mission of their lives. And then, one night, it happened. Jayla was curled up on her couch with her laptop, surrounded by empty coffee mugs and scattered notebooks. It was past midnight. She clicked. Open an old scanned article from a local town newspaper dated November 2007. It was a human interest story about a diner cook who saved a stray dog during a thunderstorm. In the background of one of the photos, barely in frame, was a waitress. Older. Black woman. Gold bracelet on her wrist. Name tag, Margaret. Jayla squinted, then zoomed in. Her heart raced. There was the bracelet. And clear as day, the peach mural behind the diner. She screamed so loudly her neighbor knocked on the wall. Liam answered her. Video call half asleep, and all he heard was, "I found her!" Now back to the helicopter. The roar of the blades was deafening, whipping dust and leaves into a frenzy as they circled the backyard. The neighbors peeked from behind curtains. Birds scattered from trees. Margaret Thompson stood frozen on her porch, shielding her eyes from the storm of wind and noise. She hadn't heard the approach. One second she was hanging laundry, the next, a full-size military-style helicopter was landing right there, in her backyard. She dropped her basket of towels. Her heart pounded. She hadn't seen anything like this in her life, except on television. As the chopper's engine began to slow, the door on the side creaked open. Out stepped a tall man in a decorated Air Force uniform, broad-shouldered, composed. He paused on the step, then offered his hand to help down a poised young woman in a black suit, heels clicking against the metal ramp. Margaret's brow furrowed. Who were they, and why did they look so familiar? The wind died down. The thumping of the blades slowed, and suddenly there was silence, just the rustling of trees and the faint hum of the machine behind them. Margaret squinted into the sunlight. Then, her breath caught. She dropped the cloth she was holding and took a step forward. "Liam?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Jayla?" The man and woman broke into wide smiles, ones she hadn't seen in nearly 2 decades. Then, in an instant, they rushed toward her. Jayla reached her first and threw her arms around Margaret, squeezing her tightly. Liam wrapped his arms around both of them. The three stood there in the middle of the yard, arms tangled, tears streaming. Margaret's apron twisted in their grip. Her knees almost gave out from the shock. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she looked from one face to the other. She stammered. "Is it really you?" Jayla nodded, her voice breaking. "It's us, Miss Margaret." "You saved our lives," she whispered, "and we never forgot." Margaret cupped Jayla's face, then turned to Liam and grabbed his hands. She couldn't believe it. These weren't the shivering children in torn clothes she had fed in a corner booth all those years ago. These were strong, accomplished, beautiful people, and they had come back. "You don't know how many nights I wondered what happened to you two," she whispered. "I always prayed someone took care of you." Liam smiled. "You did more than just take care of us. That meal, that day, it was a turning point." Jayla nodded. "You treated us like we mattered, when nobody else did." Margaret's hands trembled as she reached up to wipe her tears with the edge of her apron. "I didn't think you'd remember. I didn't even know your names." "We didn't know yours either," Liam replied. "But we remembered your face, your kindness, and your bracelet." Margaret looked down at her wrist. She was still wearing it. "Love Wins," the same one she wore the day she served them soup and grilled cheese. The same one that had slipped down her arm as she tucked biscuits into their backpack. Liam reached into his jacket and pulled out a small black velvet box. He placed it in her hand gently. "We made a promise," he said, his voice steady. "If we ever found the angel who fed us that day, we'd repay her." Margaret slowly opened the box. Inside was a single silver key, sleek, shiny, engraved with tiny lettering. Her mouth opened slightly. She looked up at them, confused. "A key?" Jayla stepped forward, beaming. "To your new home," she said. "Fully paid, in your name." Margaret nearly dropped the box. "What?" she whispered. "No, no, that's too much. I don't—" "It's not enough," Liam interrupted gently. "There's no way we could ever repay what you gave us. But this is a start." Jayla nodded. "You gave us food, dignity, hope. Now we want you to live the rest of your life in comfort." Margaret's lips quivered. She tried to speak, but no words came out. She simply clutched the key to her chest. "You were our miracle," Jayla said softly. "And today," Liam added, "we wanted to become yours." The three of them stood there, crying, laughing, hugging, in the same backyard Margaret had tended for over 30 years, except now. It wasn't just a backyard. It was the place where love came full circle. The next day, a black SUV pulled into Margaret Thompson's driveway right as the sun was rising. She stood on the porch in her best dress, the same one she wore to church on Sundays. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her purse, heart still reeling from the events of the day before. The engine idled softly as a well-dressed driver stepped out and opened the back door for her. "You ready, Miss Thompson?" he asked, with a warm smile. Margaret hesitated, glancing back at her modest little home. Weathered siding, a sagging porch swing, and the flower pots she'd been tending for years. It had always been enough for her, but now something bigger was waiting. She took a deep breath. "Let's go." The SUV rolled through familiar streets and then turned off the main road, heading up a quiet, winding path she didn't recognize. Trees lined both sides, their leaves rustling gently in the morning breeze. After a few minutes, they reached the top of a hill. There, basking in the golden light of dawn, stood a house. But not just any house. A dream. It was modern, yet warm. A 3-bedroom farmhouse-style home with a wraparound porch, hanging ferns, and white rocking chairs already in place. Fresh paint gleamed in the sun, and wildflowers danced in the gentle breeze surrounding the path. "To the front door!" Margaret gasped, stepping out slowly. Jayla and Liam were already waiting for her on the porch, beaming. This can't be mine," Margaret said, barely above a whisper. Jayla stepped forward and handed her a small folder. Inside was the deed. Her name, printed in bold letters. Margaret Elaine Thompson, fully paid. No mortgage. No strings. Margaret's lip quivered. Her knees buckled slightly. "Come inside," Liam said gently, guiding her by the hand. "There's more." The inside was just as beautiful. Hardwood floors, sunlit windows, and a kitchen. That looked like it belonged in a magazine. White marble countertops, stainless steel appliances, a window above the sink that overlooked the valley below. Margaret walked slowly, stunned silent. It wasn't just the house, it was the care, the thoughtful details. Every room felt like it was built with her in mind. She turned the corner into the kitchen, and that's when she saw it. Sitting on the counter was a small velvet box. She opened it. Inside lay a gold bracelet. Elegant, gleaming and unmistakable. "Love wins," engraved across the center. Except this time, it shimmered with tiny, delicate diamonds inset along the lettering. Jayla walked over and gently fastened it on Margaret's wrist. "We had one made just like the one you used to wear," she said. "It took us months to find the right jeweler." Margaret stared at the bracelet through teary eyes. "You taught us what those words meant," Jayla continued. "You didn't just feed us, you loved us, without knowing us, without needing anything in return." Liam nodded. "You didn't see two dirty kids, you saw two human beings." Margaret sat down at the kitchen table, holding her wrist, shaking her head in disbelief. All I did was give you lunch, she whispered. Liam smiled. No, Miss Margaret. You gave us hope. That evening, the three of them sat outside on the porch, sipping sweet tea, wrapped in warm blankets. The stars twinkled above them like diamonds scattered across a black velvet sky. Crickets chirped. The wind was soft. Margaret leaned back in her rocking chair, silent for a long while. Then she looked at them, grown now, successful, radiant with life, and said, You know, I used to wonder what happened to you two. I'd pray every now and then that someone had taken you in, that you'd made it. Jayla reached over and took her hand. You were the first person who made us feel like we could make it. Margaret looked up at the stars, her voice barely a whisper. I never thought something so small, just a meal, could come back around like this. Liam looked at her, eyes soft. It wasn't the meal. It was the way you looked at us, like we mattered. Margaret wiped her eyes. For the first time in many years, she cried, but not the tears that came from exhaustion or sorrow. These were different. They were warm, soft, healing, tears of joy. She didn't say much more that night. She didn't have to, because in her heart, she knew what that house, what that moment truly meant. Love really does win. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can echo for a lifetime. You never know who you're helping, or how they might one day change the world. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Because in a world full of chaos, a little love still wins.